Okay, welcome. I'm here with my colleague, David Tilley, and today's guest is Robert Knight. And Bob is an environmental scientist and systems ecologist with a focus on wetland and aquatic ecology. He got his BA in zoology from the University of North Carolina in 1970, and a master's degree from environmental chemistry and biology at University of North Carolina. And then he spent a couple of years at Savannah River Ecology Lab. I hope you'll talk about that a little bit later, Bob. Sure. And then his PhD in 1980 from the University of Florida, Department of Environmental Engineering. He studied under HT Odum. And the title of his dissertation was The Energy Basis of Control in Aquatic Ecosystems. And it was an ecological evaluation of Silver Springs and the Silver River. At that time, I think all the dissertations coming out had an energy basis for them. Mine was an energy basis for hierarchies in urban and regional systems. So I'm going to say roughly, Bob, and you can correct me if you're wrong, roughly the first 30 years out of graduate school, Bob's focus was on wetland treatment systems, working with HT Hill for about 17 years. And then he founded Wetland Solutions, a consulting company devoted primarily to the design and permitting of wetland treatment systems. And that was in 1988. And he remains the president of that organization, that consultant firm. And during that 17 years, he served as principal author on more than 100 technical papers on treatment wetland permitting, design, and operation, and led the design efforts for about 20 full-scale wetland treatment systems throughout the Southeast. And you can't say this about many people, but Bob wrote the book on treatment wetlands with Bob Cadlick. That was published in 1996. And then for the last 15 years, Bob's interest sort of returned to springs. He founded the HT Odum Florida Springs Institute in 2010, and he remains the director of that. He designed and implemented comprehensive monitoring programs for a number of springs to quantify necessary pollutant load reduction goals. He conducted a 50-year Silver Springs retrospective study to provide a quantitative comparison between current and historical. That retrospective is the fact that HT studied the Silver Springs and produced his monograph and ecological monographs on the Silver Springs in 1953. I'm not sure. I worked with regulatory agencies to establish minimum flows and levels for a number of Florida springs throughout Florida, and conducted a landmark ecosystem comparison of 13 Florida springs, and has developed comprehensive springs restoration plan for a number of them. And that 13 Florida springs is, again, sort of following in HT's footsteps, because he had done a comparative analysis of a bunch of springs. So, Bob, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Please correct anything that I misconstrued in my digging through the internet to come up with something to say.
You did a really good job, Mark. Just a couple of things. I spent 17 years with HT Hill in consulting, and then I started Wetland Solutions actually in 1998. In 2000, I incorporated that, and I spent 17 years with Wetland Solutions and retired in 2017. So I am no longer a member of Wetland Solutions. My son and two other partners are now running that business and are very successful doing that. I started the Springs Institute in 2010, and I retired last year as the executive director of the Springs Institute. So now I'm the president of the board of the Florida Springs Institute, but not running it anymore. So with those two minor corrections, everything was really great. Thank you for that summary. You did a lot of work. I thought I'd have to send you a bio, but you did it all yourself. So thank you.
Well, it's out there, you know. I think the internet knows more about us than we do. So I'm interested, you obviously come from Chapel Hill, so you were at the University of North Carolina to do your bachelor's and your master's. Did you know HT at that time?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Let me just give a brief earlier history than that. I was raised by a Navy captain, and we traveled my whole childhood um, to Egypt, to Jacksonville, Florida, to Maryland, to North Carolina, Kalamazoo, North Carolina. And then my dad retired, and he moved us to Iowa, where he was a scientist. He was an entomologist fighting malaria during the Second World War, and mosquito expert. He was a world mosquito expert, and he moved us to Iowa State, where he took a position teaching. And so I did a lot of growing up there. I went to high school there, middle school and high school there, and started college at Iowa State University. And I was trying to follow in my brother's footsteps in physics, so I started as a physics major for 2 years. And after 2 years, I looked around the class, started with 40 of us, and it was down to 12 after 2 years. And I looked around my class, and there were only 11 physicists in the room. So I decided it was time to do something else. And at the same time, Iowa State University found out that I was no longer an in-state student because my parents had moved away when I started college. Dad had taken another position at the University of Georgia. And so I could not afford the out-of-state tuition since I was putting myself through college. And my dad enrolled me at Chapel Hill. And I thought that was a good time to change majors, so I changed to zoology, which is very different from physics in terms of certain aspects of your mental abilities. All you have to do is remember things. Of course, I can't do that now at all, but I could remember things then. And I loved Chapel Hill. I mean, it was just wonderful. I worked at the library with good friends. I was on the fencing team at Chapel Hill. I started fencing at Iowa State and got to the fence as a varsity fencer at Chapel Hill. And so I went through the whole undergraduate thing. And my final semester, or just before my final semester, a friend suggested that I should take Dr. Odom's class. I hadn't. My advisor was Elizabeth McMahon, who was a great friend of Dr. Odom's, and I'd worked with him on the Puerto Rico project and Chapel Hill. She spent a lot of time with his family, the whole family, the Odum family. And she never suggested it, I don't think, but this other friend suggested I take Dr. Odom's ecology class. What was it, ecology or environment and something systems, ecological systems. And so I did. I just, came into the class. I enrolled for it and came into it, and it blew my mind right from the beginning. I mean, after 4 years of college, I finally found what I wanted to do. And this guy, this Howard Odum, and I just, totally indoctrinated me. Somebody that explained the world that I was knowledgeable of. I've been spending that many years in the world, and nothing made sense. I enjoyed genetics and some other courses. I enjoyed entomology, of course, just going out and collecting insects. But I finally felt like I could understand how these systems work. And so that really prepped me. And somehow, and I can't remember the details, I got a job with Dr. Odum. I think it was Dr. McMahon. I'm sure it was Dr. McMahon, Betty, his friend. She was working at Morehead City with him on some of his projects. And she wanted to do a project in the salt marsh that was receiving treated wastewater. And so this was discussed by some of your previous speakers, John Day, and I think Walt Boynton or Walter was down there too, some, but Hank Keller and a lot of people were working on the Marine Lab project, the Morehead City Marine Lab project with the ponds. But there's the creek where the wastewater was actually being discharged was Calico Creek, and it was a Spartina marsh. It was 100% Spartina marsh. And Dr. McMahon wanted to, I'm sure Dr. Odum had put her up to this, study the insect fauna of the salt marsh that was receiving wastewater and a salt marsh that wasn't receiving wastewater. And so we built these boardwalks out in the salt marsh. Somebody donated like 50 giant pecan tree boards that his orchard had been cut down, and he had it all sawed up, and and he was just throwing these away. And so we built a boardwalk out in the middle of the salt marsh, and I constructed a 1 by 1 meter box, a biomass box is what we called it. And there was another person of my age from Chapel Hill, Alan Camp, and we both moved to Morehead City. We lived in the Marine Lab, you know, with the seminars and stuff, and spent a lot of time with Dr. Odum. But we didn't work on the ponds at all. In fact, I don't think I ever saw the pond. I just saw the salt marsh. And we went out there with this biomass box, took a generator with us. We put a light trap on in the side of the box, and the two of us would go out there and put this box down over different parts of the salt marsh, and then we'd turn on a vacuum cleaner and vacuum out all the bugs. And that was Dr. McMahon's work, and it was just a great summer. It was like a summer. I worked only half days, so I spent the rest of the time at the beach, and had some great relationships. But that was just my first really taste of research science, and she published it. It was fantastic. You know, the dogma is that monocultures don't have diversity, right? And the salt marsh is the most monoculture community I've ever worked in. You know, it's all spartina, and there's littorina snails and things like that you see, but there's really nothing else that you see until you start vacuuming the insect community and the arachnid community. It was full of different species of insects and arachnids, very high diversity. And Dr. McMahon published those papers. They're in the Dr. Odum's report. You know, Dr. Odum didn't publish the Morehead City pond study until many years later, and I really respected him for taking the time to do that so late in his career when he was doing so many other things. He did that, and he never let a piece of data really go unpublished. I mean, it was incredible. It was really incredible the things he did, the level of effort he went to publish. But anyway, that's how I got started. And the thing that came out of that is Dr. Odum was moving to Florida that fall in September. Well, he was moving there that summer. So that was the first half of the summer, and the last half of the summer, I was back hiking and stuff in the mountains in North Carolina. But Dr. Odum moved to Florida, and he said, "Why don't you come with me?" I wanted to do a PhD, or I wanted to do a master's with him at that point. And so I said, "Sure, I'll do that." And I enrolled at Florida. By then, my parents had moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, and no, they were in North Carolina. Yeah, so I moved to Florida on my own, and with a Volkswagen, all my worldly possessions in a Volkswagen. I wasn't able to buy more gas than fit in a Coke bottle at that time. I lived in the lowest part of town, but I had Dr. Odum myself. I mean, I was the only graduate student that was there at the beginning of that semester, and so I had him to myself, and it was really neat because I was in Blackhall, and I was pretty much a hippie at that time, very against the war and everything.
Let me interrupt you just for 1 second. I had lunch a week or so ago with Wayne Huber, and he said, really? Bob Knight, I remember Bob Knight. He was a barefoot, long-haired hippie that
Thank you. I was
in Blackhall.
Dr. Odum called me Bobby Barefoot, and they passed a resolution in Blackhall that you could not come in the building barefoot because of me. But I had one friend at that time, and he lived in his van, and so we were a real pair. But really having Dr. Odum and myself was really neat for a while. And that's when Environment, Power, and Society came out. He gave me a copy of that book and said, "Read this," and so it was really neat, and it was a good start. But I wasn't ready, and I had my girlfriend was in Chapel Hill, and I really had to go back to Chapel Hill. So I only stayed one semester. Dr. Odum gave me a stipend to model the economy of the United States of America. That's what I worked on that semester. I had never had a course in economics, and so I just made up economics myself and came up with a model of the United States economy. But it was never published. And at the end of the year, I took off back for Chapel Hill for Chapel Hill. And then, the other interesting thing is you interviewed Suzanne Bailey. I met her when I got back to Chapel Hill. Odum set it up so that I would take her job at the University of North Carolina. She was studying University Lake on an EPA project with Charlie Weiss, and I took over her job doing the owl assay procedure, the use of Solanastrum capricornutum algae as a test on toxicity and water samples. And so I closed out that project at Chapel Hill. I just spent a whole year just as a research assistant, and that really was neat because of my first mesocosms. I put bags, large, basically body bags, out in the lake and put algae and different concentrations of nutrients in those to see how the algae responded in the actual environment. And we were also doing laboratory studies at the same time in flasks with the algae. And I learned very early that sciences can be tricky. The algae were totally controlled by phosphorus in the lab, but by nitrogen in the lab, but phosphorus in the lake. There was the relationship was totally different between these little laboratory systems and the actual environmental system where you had a volume of water. So I learned that early, but that got me going into aquatic ecology really big time. And I did my master's with Charlie Weiss and Ed Kunstler were on my committee, and I studied the destruction of algae in the Allen steam plant on Lake Norman, or one of the Duke Power lakes, and so I worked in a power plant for my master's research. It was in the School of Public Health, and in a year and a half I got my master's degree in public health. So
that was the nuclear plant, right?
No, this is a coal-fired plant. The Allen steam plant was a coal plant. Okay. And I don't think it's Lake Norman. It's I just heard it again the other day, but it's not coming to mind. But that I wanted to come back and study with Odum, and by then I was, what was the progress? Oh, okay. I wasn't ready to come back, but I was getting there. And when I finished my master's, I took a job at Savannah River Ecology Laboratory, and which lasted for 4 years, and it was fantastic. Working out in the middle of the Savannah River plant, having this 400 square mile area of nobody was allowed on it except us, and we could carry shotguns because we were doing research. And I studied artificial streams, and so once again, mesocosm type systems, but on a large scale. They were at the Hector, an old reactor location, and I studied with Hank Kanya, who was working on his PhD. And we had EPA funding to evaluate the toxicity of mercury and cadmium, two heavy metals, on these aquatic ecosystems. And during that time, I got in touch with Odum. I saw him at the LNO conference in probably 1972 or something like that. And I asked him, well, I guess it was 73. I asked him if I could come back yet. When I left Gainesville, when I was with him that fall, he said, come back when you're ready, and so it was sort of expected that I was going to come back and work on a PhD. And so I called him, and his wife had just died. She died in 1973, Ginny, his wife. And he said, I'm just overloaded now. He had like 13 or 14 graduate students, all you guys that were there, working on the Cypress Dome project, and everything's just starting. He had a lot going on. So he said, not now, and get back to me later. So I did the 4 years at the ecology laboratory, and then got in touch with Dr. Odum, and he was ready for me to come back. So I moved to Gainesville in 77. So that sort of that's the early history that leads up.
Yeah. So it's interesting that no matter what, you were bound and determined that you were going to study with him. He had that big of an impact on you. I mean,
there was nobody else that I ever thought of. I mean, I don't know that I would have got a PhD. a PhD was sort of expected in my family because my father was one. But
Yeah.
I had two older brothers, and neither of them had gotten their PhD by that point. So I beat them.
Did you
But
really?
all four of the boys in the family have Coots, go away. My dog is keeping me coming. All four boys got PhDs. My sister got a master's, and so it was a very academic family. And two of my brothers are college professors. So the PhD is then program is, I guess, my main interaction with Odum was at that point, starting in '77. So '77 to '80 to '81. When I finished my postdoc, was my main overlap with Dr. Odum.
So we got our PhDs in the same year. You got it in '80.
Same semester, December 1980. Mark, I've been on course of competition with you for as long as I can remember. I applied when Dr. Odum retired. We both applied for the job, and you won. You beat me out fair and square, and you've done a great job. But the one thing I regret is all those years I was in consulting, I hardly ever saw Dr. Odum. I would come to a seminar occasionally.
Yeah.
But I didn't go to events. I didn't go to parties. I didn't really have much time to interact with him. So I really, really regret that part of my life where I wasn't around him. I was out trying to impress him with treating wetlands and springs and stuff like that, but I just didn't have the time with him I wish I had.
Yeah. Well, it was amazing.
And you were living it vicariously for me.
So did you work on the Crystal River project when you got back?
Yeah, when I came back, that's what he put me on. So I worked on it the whole time, and then I worked with John Caldwell, but I worked with a lot of the people that you're interviewing, and I've got all the reports here. I have right here. I got a whole stack. I've got the original reports because I ended up writing the final report for the Crystal River project. That was my postdoc. And on the project itself, I was out there doing the oxygen studies after Mike Kemp and Hank McKellar had left. I was pretty much doing the oxygen studies, and so doing titrations, essentially 24-hour days out there collecting samples day and night, rain or shine. I was out there in the fog and pouring rain, running those oyster reefs full speed with a motorboat. I mean, I got to know the oyster reefs, and collecting our samples and then taking them back in the lab right by the nuclear plant there, doing our titrations for oxygen.
I was going to see if we could actually talk a little bit about the nuclear power plant, just kind of give us some context for when that had been built and what was going on with the study. Was the study before or after it already been operating, or kind of just the sketch of the timeline there?
Yeah, it was a coal-fired power plant that they built a nuclear plant there. Secondly, and I don't know the exact year that the nuclear plant was built, but the study, both those things were in place at the time of the study. So there was an intake canal that was built out like 12 miles into the Gulf of Mexico to bring in cooler water, and then it was discharged into a discharge canal, which was very short, went right out into the bay. And so this cooling water was coming in. Good, the dog went outside. Was coming in this intake canal, and everything else was coming in with it. So all the biota out in the Gulf of Mexico was getting sucked into this intake canal. And so that was, it wasn't our study, but there was a study going on of the destruction of the biota by the intake canal. Our study was the thermal regime in the discharge area and how that was affecting the ecology of the area, because they wanted to build, they were told by EPA they had to build cooling towers for the power plant. They wanted to add another unit, another coal-fired unit, and they would have to build cooling towers for that. And so Dr. Odum got in on that, and that's what our research was mostly about, was the metabolism of the bay, the health of the bay, the assimilation of the heat, and the overall net benefit. So it was really an energy study of what was using Odum's principles of the net energy of the bay versus a cooling tower. Cooling tower was $1 billion at that time, and it didn't seem to make sense to Dr. Odum to have a cooling tower because the bay had been receiving this hot water for quite a long time. So we had the inner bay, we had middle bay, we had outer bay, and we had control areas. And there were these oyster reefs that naturally grow there parallel to the shoreline at various depths, and they were holding. That's why the inner bay was delineated by this oyster reef, and there were passages through it where the water would flow in and out. And then the next one, and so we would run out there in a motorboat. We had a Boston whaler boat. I think they only lost one boat on that study, but the Boston whalers were unsinkable. Thank goodness. We would have all died if they had sunk. And we would run out there and get our samples day and night. And some great stories. I mean, Carl Lindbergh, I think, was in one of the pictures the other day with Bill Mitch's. I mean, when I looked at Bill Mitch's presentation, Carl Lindbergh she's in one of my pictures. And she was there with me one night. We were out there and collecting samples, and it's pitch black. Everything's, we're out in the middle of the bay at night, pitch black. And you look back at the power plant, it's all lit up. The power plants are they burn a lot of electricity lighting themselves up. So it was just lit up. And all of a sudden we heard this enormous explosion. And we turned and looked at the power plant, and there was a mushroom cloud coming out of the power plant. And she thought it was the end of the world. It was the end of the world, and we were all going to die. And calm down, because it had happened one time before, but I hadn't seen it so vividly. The intake canal got plugged by jellyfish. The whole intake screen, about 1 million jellyfish came in the intake canal and plugged up the screen. So there was no cooling water from the nuclear reactor. And so it stops suddenly. It shuts off automatically when there's no cooling water. It's a steam release. There's all this steam that's built up. And that's what the explosion was. That's what the cloud was the steam release. And it was very striking. It was really neat. And it happened one other time too, and it was batfish the other time while I was there. I think it happened probably multiple times, but I was there twice when it happened, when they had to do an emergency shutdown on the power plant.
Wow.
That's crazy. That's crazy. Thanks. It seems so relevant too today, because everybody's talking about rebuilding these newer versions of nuclear power plants with the small modular reactors. I don't know if you've.
Yeah, no, I've been following it. Yeah, it's a big deal, and I tell you, I hope we never build another nuclear plant because of the nuclear waste associated with it. They don't have it. We don't have any good way of solving that problem that's come up in 50 years. Just one other thing about the project. The finding was that the inner bay was definitely impacted. I mean, it had been pretty much reduced to a microbial community, and not an emergent or a marine algae community. But by the time you got to the middle bay, productivity was actually increased. The overall metabolism was increased, and overall the net effect was pretty much a positive effect on the estuary. God, the fishing in that discharge canal in the wintertime. The redfish would come in there in that hot water, and people would be out there in boats, and they would catch a redfish on every cast, and these were all 3 to 5 pound fish, and they would just fill their ice chests and leave. It was just unbelievable, the productivity of that. Just when you add hot water to an estuarine system, there's this stimulation. In fact, there always is a stimulation. All our pollutant sources create a stimulation before there's a negative effect. And we should come back to that when we talk about my doctoral research. But that stimulatory effect is what I studied at Silver Springs.
Yeah.
But that's what I did for those years. For the first 2 years, that's all I did.
So then we're going to go to the Silver Springs. That's the next thing. How did you decide how did you and/or HT decide to do your dissertation on the Silver Springs?
Well, at the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory, like I said, we studied mercury and cadmium, and the last 2 years of this study was on cadmium, which is a heavy metal, and I was interested in the stimulatory effect of these heavy metals as well as the toxic effect of them. And it turns out that cadmium and mercury have a stimulatory effect, and I studied that in health physics when I had Dr. Bolch at Black Hall studying health physics, which was basically the physics of radiation. And one of the things that had been observed was that there was an effect at lower concentrations of radiation that were stimulatory. And then I started studying cadmium, and there's a stimulatory effect at low levels. And in pharmacology, it's called the Arndt-Schultz effect, and nowadays they call it hormesis. But it was the subsidy stress effect that HT Odum published, which is the major paper that he did. One that most influenced me from HT Odum was his subsidy stress paper, because it's true with all these, almost every stimulus has a toxic effect when it gets too high, And so I'd done that cadmium research, and Dr. Odum, of course, I informed him about what I'd been doing. And he said, well, let's write a grant to EPA to write that up as a report. And so there's actually a report on my cadmium study at the Center for Wetlands. It was one of Dr. Odum's found reports, and it was our deliverable to EPA. That was the only money that ever came in for restudying Silver Springs. But as Dr. Odum so often did, he used whatever resources were available to get the job done, and it oftentimes got out of context, but it was important. It was important to the issue. And so what I was going to study was the stimulatory effects of fish really at Silver Springs, and well, the biota in general, the consumers, the controlling effect of consumers at Silver Springs, and relate that back to my toxicity study, which is what my dissertation's about. So the dissertation has two models, and it has one for cadmium, it has one for the biota at Silver Springs. And I was the luckiest person in the world to come in. I think that was Dr. Odum's last biological type study, was the Silver Springs restudy. And so I felt incredibly fortunate to have that and to have him there. And Scott Nixon came down, but Dr. Odum didn't come out to Silver Springs very much. He was taking classes out of Silver Springs during your time, Mark, but he really wasn't doing that during my time there. But I was going to Silver Springs all the time. I never had trouble getting volunteers to go with me, and it was just a cushy job, And by that time, we had a hydro lab, and the hydro lab would read the oxygen without having to do titrations, which was good, because I went out for about a dozen or a couple dozen field trips, and I did metabolism about a dozen times over the period from 1979 to 1980 when I was doing this work. And many times, whenever I did metabolism, I went out and spent the night, and usually by myself. I'd take my dog out with me. Hank was my dog by then. He was my boss at the ecology lab, but I named my dog after him. And we would put the boat in at the Ray Landing, and it was a university boat. I had a van and a boat I could use. Both of them were heavily used before me. And Hank and I would run up the Silver River full speed before there was no wake zone on the river. And really got to know the Silver River well. And he'd be up in the front of the boat, and his ears would be out flapping like this, riding how a dog rides in a car or a truck. And a lot of times during the day, there'd be people going with me too. I'd have somebody with me. But so I did metabolism the whole spring, and that was Dr. Odum wanted me to reproduce as many of his measurements as was possible in the time available, which I did. And so I doubled about the number of metabolism measurements that he had done. I did about twice as many, and they were very comparable to what he'd gotten previously. And the oxygen was going up during the day, it was going down at night, and it was roughly the same. There were some slight changes that I didn't determine until later. But I did that. But then the most important part of the study for me was I didn't quantify everything in Silver Springs like he did. I couldn't do it on my own. He had a team of people doing it. But the most important thing to me was to put out mesocosms and to control consumers in mesocosms. And so we had a disagreement. I wanted to do whole river mesocosms, basically in the river, like I'd done at Chapel Hill with University Lake with my bags. I wanted to have flow-through mesocosms in the river, actually simulating the whole river, but in a plastic tube. And so I developed a flow-through mesocosm system where there were 9 of these tubes. They were 16 feet long. They were just plastic tubing. I mean, thin plastic, like baggy type plastic with a large fitting at the front to concentrate flow through it, and a fitting at the end. And I had my hydrolate. I had a pump going where I could pump water up from each of the tubes at the one pump, one station at the upstream end where I get the water going into the tubes, and a separate tube coming from every tube. And so I was able to measure the productivity in these systems. In about 2 weeks, they would totally colonize what I call now the good algae, the paraphyte and paraphytic algae that was growing in Silver Springs on the Sagittaria at that time. It was the healthy algae. When silver was healthy, it was a diatom community that lived on those plants, and that's where 2/3 of the productivity was that Odum measured, was just that algae, that the brown slime on the leaves was what was doing most of the productivity in Silver Springs. And so that my tubes colonized with that. I didn't put plants in them. I didn't need to. They made a nice community. I could measure the metabolism in these tubes. I could put dye tracer in and measure the residence time and estimate the flows through them. And so I set up those tubes, and then I could put screens on them, and I could control the consumer community in those tubes, which I did. So I did multiple studies with the Alemia snails, which were the dominant snail in Silver Springs, and that was on all the Sagittaria at that time. And I put control numbers in and measured the productivity after a period of colonization, through a period of colonization. And then I did it for Gambusia. I put in the next higher level in the trophic food web. I put in mosquito fish, and they were preying on the chironomids that were growing on the natural food chain. There is the diatoms growing on the plants, eaten by insect larvae, mostly chironomids, redworms, but healthy ones from a healthy type ecosystem. And then those were eaten, of course, by the small fish, which were eaten by the larger fish. And that was sort of the food chain in Silver Springs. And so I was duplicating that in there and did those studies. And I mean, I just found amazing things. I found out that there was a concentration of fish and of snails that maximized the productivity of Silver Springs. And that was, I thought, a test of the maximum power principle.
Yeah.
Because when I compared those densities to what was actually in Silver Springs, what Dr. Odum had measured, they were very similar. They were very comparable. And I've always thought that was almost a direct test of the maximum power principle in a biological system. It's never been repeated. I mean, nobody's tried to repeat it. I've used those mesocosms since then on spring studies, but not for that purpose. And so it was a unique little thing that was very satisfactory. And the other thing I did out there was I did fish counts. And so 2 of my colleagues from the university would drive me around the boat, just a little John boat, and we would cover all of the upper 3/4 mile of Silver River. And they would drag me around, and I was counting all the fish and reporting to them what I was seeing. And that was fun. I did that 4 times. So those fish counts turned out to be very important later on, because Dr. Odum had estimated the fish biomass really carefully. Well, although you can't find any of the raw data, but he had an estimate in his paper, in his 1957 paper, of the biomass in all the species. So I repeated that multiple times. And my one anecdote from that was I was in the head spring. They were dragging me around the head spring. And I happened to look over my shoulder, and there was an alligator right behind me, following me. I said, "Hey, there's an alligator back there. Why don't you tell me?" And they said, "Well, we didn't want to scare you." But that was the only time one followed me there. So that was cute. But so I got fish counts, and the fish populations were down over 60%, and so river compared to what Dr. Odum had measured 25 years before. And
Were there any big channel bass when you were doing it?
no, the striped bass were gone. I mean, they really weren't there during.
I'm sorry, channel catfish, the channel
Yeah,
cat.
the channel catfish were totally gone by then.
Yeah.
And so I attributed it to the Rodman Dam, the Rodman Reservoir, and the Kirkpatrick Dam downstream on the Ottawa River. And that's the final thing, in the final paragraph of my dissertation is, wouldn't it be a neat experiment to blow up the Rodman Dam? So we removed the Rodman Dam and said blow it up. I might have gotten accused of something by then, and I'm still working on that. But that's another issue to talk about. But that was that work. And Dr. Odum, he wanted me to do these recirculating mesocosms like he did with Bob Byers, with Dr. Byers. And I worked under Bob Byers at the Stanford Ecology Laboratory. Dr. Odum's first PhD student was Byers, either him or Jack Ewell, one or the other. They both claimed that. But Bob Byers, he did the mesocosm book with Bob Byers, and Bob Byers was the head of the ecology lab when I was there at first, just for a little while. But so I was real happy with the mesocosm work. I did something Dr. Odum didn't think would work, but it worked really well, and I just had a very satisfying experience, and graduated at the same time. But what Dr. Odum didn't do, he didn't help me at all find a job. Well, he did the first time when I took Suzanne Bailey's job. He didn't help me at that point, and I didn't ask for help. I'd never even thought about what I was going to do after I got done with that. I was having so much fun, and so I didn't have a job in 1980, and so I took over closing out the Crystal River study with a young man. But Clay Montague was the principal investigator at that point. The last 2 years of the study, Clay and John Caldwell had stepped down as a supervisor, and Clay was listed as the principal investigator. But I wrote the final report with this one other fellow, and then I finally found a job, and I tried the universities, and they weren't hiring, at least not me at that time, so I took a job in consulting. I thought, well, damn it, I wanted to be faculty, but I'll take this consulting job, and that was the next best thing I ever did, was taking that job with CH Odum Hill.
Yeah. Well, that was a storied career at CH2M. I mean, amazing amount of work you did on treatment wetlands all throughout the Southeast. What made you decide to open your own firm?
Well, I did that for 17 years with CH Odum Hill. They were growing during that whole time. It was a firm of about 3,000 people when I started, and it was nationwide. And I worked on wetland projects all over the United States, one end of the country to the other. Over 200 projects I worked on during that time, and did feasibility studies or actual designs and research studies on those projects. But they were just starting. Brian Winchester was their one environmental scientist in the Florida office. They'd started the Florida office with Black, actually. Dr. Black Hall's named after, had been with them. It was Black, Crow, and Eisnitz when they purchased the company here in Florida. And so there was this legacy there. The founders were still involved with the company at that time, but that changed over time. And we had just incredible teamwork. Well, first of all, I did more and more treatment wetland projects. Brian had one treatment wetland project, the Pottsburg Creek Swamp, which was a discharge into a natural swamp in Jacksonville. And he'd been studying that. Very interesting place. And then I developed a bunch more natural system projects. One was the Reedy Creek system at Disney World, and did a publication on that system, studied it, and did a publication with Ted McKim, who was the head engineer at Disney at that time. And then did sea pines up in Hilton Head Island with that client, and studied their existing system, and then designed some new systems there. And did a whole bunch of designs up at in South Carolina in Horry County with the Grand Strand Water and Sewer Authority, Carolina Bay projects, and the Conway Swamp, and did a bunch of studies up there on natural wetlands, and that all then led to the first. I was really pushing wetlands treatment in Florida, hosting symposia. I was the chair of the Water Resources Committee for the Florida Pollution Control Association, sort of the Florida section of the AWWA. And so I was really pushing treatment wetlands, but I was also learning about treatment wetlands and reviewing all the ones that you guys had done at the cypress domes. I had several cypress projects in Pasco County. But what I was seeing consistently was that we were really damaging these ecosystems beyond the point that was really should be allowed in wetlands and natural wetlands. And I was killing trees. And when you add additional water to a wetland that's not adapted to continuous flooding, you kill the trees. And it always happens. And when you have a continuous water source to a system that's intermittent. So sort of my capstone project was the Great Swamp Project there in South Carolina, in Beaufort County, South Carolina, where we had a 500-acre natural swamp that was receiving treated wastewater. And by then, I'd figured out the main exacerbation on the mortality was ammonia in the wastewater. If there was any ammonia in the wastewater, it was much more toxic to the trees because ammonia has a very high consumption of oxygen. And so by that time, in the Great Swamp, I found a swamp that was dominated by cypress and gum, which are the two most tolerant species. And the client very happily removed all the ammonia before putting the water into the system. That system's still running to this day. So it started in 1999. So it's got 25 years of operational experience, and it's been expanded with another 500 acres. But it still is, there were impacts, and the maples and oaks and things like that. There were a few of those in the system. They died, but we planted probably over 20,000 cypress trees in the system. It's just beautiful cypress swamp now, and so that's still going on. But it was those projects then that led to writing the book and working with Cadillac, and actually it was the time I spent with Cadillac on the Everglades project. So he was the main consultant to the federal government on the stormwater treatment areas in South Florida, and I was main consultant for the Water Management District at that time. And so we worked together on the design of those. I did a preliminary review of their first project before it was built. What was it called? But that time and that exposure to Bob Cadillac is what led to the book, Treatment Wetlands. And Cadillac's the first author. He's the greatest treatment wetland expert in the world, still operational as far as I know. Incredible mentor for me, chemical engineer, but brilliant enough to completely learn ecology and environmental things as well. And he started with the Houghton Lake project up in Michigan that was discussed, that Kathy Ewell visited, and that was a peat swamp, and they had major impacts there to kill the trees, but turned it into a cattail marsh. But it really worked well.
That was a sister project to the Cypress Wetland project.
We were going on at the same time, yeah. But I beat both of those with the Calico Creek project I did with Dr. Odom at Morehead City. So I was studying a wetland, receiving wastewater before any of those. So I'd like to claim that supremacy, but we weren't studying the nutrients at that time, at least not in the marsh. But that led to the book with Dr. Cadlick. I took off from CH Stone Hill for a half-time for a couple of years, so I had basically a full year put into that book, and it was published in 1996. But at the same time, the company had grown to probably 20,000 people. It was being run by the next generation of leaders who were totally into big projects, Superfund projects, hazardous waste projects. They had broken up the team work that we had, where we had different pigeonholes for different types of work, where all the environmental scientists worked together and stuff. And it was just very uncomfortable. I tried to get them fired. I became the leader of the revolt. I was a key employee. There were only 600 key employees out of all these employees, and I was one of those. And I was communicating, and they came down. The president of the eastern part of the company came down and told our office manager to fire me. He wouldn't do it because I was bringing in so much money for that part of the company, and but he finally talked me into leaving. He says, you're just hitting your head against the wall here. The train's left the station, is what he said. And, he said, you need to be a sole proprietor. And so it was his suggestion that I left in 1998. And for 2 years, I just kept working on the projects I'd had at CH Stone Hill. Those projects, I was the project manager on them. They didn't have the capacity to do them. And so I kept doing CH Stone Hill projects, but I did it for my own gain, which was enormous. And then in 2000, the guy that worked with me at CH Stone Hill finally decided to leave and come join me. And that's when I started Wetland Solutions in 2000. And the next 10 years, we had hundreds of projects, and many of them came from CH Stone Hill. But the next person that left CH Stone Hill, Chris Keller, they put their foot down, and the regional office manager said, no more projects to Wetland Solutions. But by then we were heavily involved in South Florida and with projects around the rest of the country. I had quite a reputation at that point. So we never had trouble getting work until the economic downturn, and it was years after that. It wasn't until about 2010 or so, whatever, that things got tough. I cut back on the company a little bit. It was a small company always, and then we geared back up after that. And I was working in Springs starting in 2002, the Water Management District. You want me to stop here and pause while you ask more questions about that earlier part? Yeah, I'm going to go with the Wetland Solutions part next if we've got time.
Yeah. I would be nice to go back a little bit and talk about the influence that HT had on your dissertation work, for instance. And the other thing we always want to know is, did you take his course while you were here as a student, or had you had enough of him at Chapel Hill you didn't need to?
No, I came to Gainesville to be with Dr. Odom, and I took all his courses. I took environmental meteorology with Huber and Odom, and systems ecology, and we were studying from the paper copy of his systems
ecological general systems.
Yeah, and so we were testing it out for him, and like you said, you were taking tests in the hallways and stuff like that. And I was there in Black Hall for part of that time, and then over in the basement of the Center for Wetlands part of that time. And I was interacting with everybody that was there, but the first crop from Chapel Hill had pretty much left by the time I started in '77. So it was a new round. It was Pat Kangas and Jim Bays and Walt Boynton and then the hobbits, I call them, Karin Lindbergh and Scott Leibowitz and Helen Kennedy. Those are my compatriots, and so and Dr. Odom, of course. But yeah, it was a great influence on my dissertation. The treatment wetland thing was all about trying to implement what Dr. Odom started, which you guys had done so much groundwork on, and to improve it. And that's what we did over that time. The 34 years I was doing treatment wetlands work, that just got better and better to the point where, I mean, the first project I did at CH Odum Hill was a conceptual plan of the Sweetwater wetland. That was my first project in 1981. And that got built in 2013 to 2015. Sweetwater wetland got built. So it finally came around. At that point, we had really made almost all the mistakes you could make in treatment wetlands and knew how to design a treatment wetland. And I go out there and walk every week now. It's just an amazing thing. And that's a testament to Dr. Odom's foresight and Bob Cadleck's and many other people that worked in the wetland technology. But it's just amazing. The first constructed wetlands were built in 1987. Really, the first ones post Buckley, Shue, and Jernigan did those at Lakeland and at Iron Bridge. And you laid out the design at Iron Bridge, Mark. I remember seeing it in your house when we were over there for breakfast. You had a layout of the Iron Bridge system at that time, and those systems are still operational. They're so great, and that's a tribute to Dr. Odom. So that was my main thing. But then springs never left my attention, and once again, you brought me back into that. It's a tribute to you because you were busy at the time when the Florida Springs Initiative was going on, and they wanted you to do that 50-year retrospective study, I believe. And you suggested they come to me. I was working on springs at that time with the St. John's District. They'd hired me for the Blue Springs MFL, the Blue Springs MFL. And I was there being trained to be their expert because they were expecting a lot of pushback on the manatee issue at Blue Springs. That didn't happen, but then I just fell naturally into 2004, the project, the 50-year retrospective study project. Got to study Silver Springs completely for another year and repeat everything that Odom had done. We used all his methods that we could. I worked with the University of Florida and with the district to do that. But that launched me into the recognition that the springs had changed enormously since Dr. Odom's time and since my time in the 70s. They had really changed. They were going downhill fast, and that led to the establishment of the Florida Springs Institute, which I also did in tribute to Dr. Odom, because he and I wrote a letter to the president of University of Florida in 1980 asking the university to set up an institute at a spring, at Silver Springs. And I've got the letter from Marston that said, "Thank you, good idea, but no." As you know, Mark, I came back and tried to do that while I was at CH, I was with Wetland Solutions. I wanted to have the Springs Institute at the University of Florida, and Dr. Haney, who was the chairman of the department at the time, was very helpful and pulled all the Springs researchers at the university together with me to discuss it, and we discussed it at a couple of meetings. And the dean, we just got the Water Institute about that time, and the dean was happy with that and didn't need anything else. And if I could bring $1 million, I couldn't bring the Springs Institute to the University of Florida. So that's why I started it on my own in 2010. And
it's all about the money. It's all about the money.
Yeah, but it's a small nonprofit, and we've been building, and we're still in existence 14 years later. It's a really important thing that I've done. And once again, I do it out of respect for Dr. Odom's lessons. Like I said, I really missed a big chunk of his life. Yeah. But I did get back together with him before he passed away, and so I sort of closed it out with that. And I'm just happy to remember. I'm really happy with what you're doing with these lectures, these podcasts.
So it's really hard. I can have a hard time remembering anything, especially when somebody asks me, well, tell me an interesting thing about you and HT, but I'm going to ask you, can you remember any particular instances where he blew your mind, or you looked at him? Because I remember one time looking at him and said, either I'm crazy or he's crazy. And I guess it must be me.
No, I never thought he was crazy. I disagreed with him a few times. We're driving up to a water conference in Tallahassee. I was riding with him in his little car, and we were driving up there, and we were out just getting onto 1998, that road along the coast, and some vultures flew over, and he said, turkey vultures. And no, there were black vultures, Dr. Odum. He says, no, they weren't. They were turkey vultures. and you know, the guy was raised as a bird watcher, and here I was disagreeing with him, but I'd been bird watching for a long time at that point, doing Christmas bird counts for 40 some years, and I knew my vultures. But anyway, we disagreed on that. We never worked that out. But when we got to that conference, they wouldn't let me in. There was by paid admission only, and I said, I paid $100 to go in and hear his lecture that day.
Wow.
I went in and listened to his lecture. I paid $100 registration to go in and hear Dr. Odum. So that's how much I care about that guy.
Yeah.
One thing, he only came down to Silver with me one time. And I took a lasting picture of him. Oh, actually, he was there with Scott Nixon too, but he only went out on the boat with me one time. And we were coming up the Silver River. He was looking at the river, and there's all these cypress knees out in the water, you know. And he says, look at the erosion along here. This is totally different than it looked when I was here in the 50s. And so the motorboat traffic on the Silver River, which I was part of, my research was part of, was eroding all of the soil that those cypress trees originally had been planted or grown up in, and where their knees don't grow out in the water, you know, they grow on the land to provide oxygen for the low oxygen conditions the roots are in. And but he noticed that, and I was very impressed with that.
My dog's keeping me company too.
I never found anything he said as being lacking truth. I mean, I learned some things from him.
I'm gonna go shut the dog up.
Do you want me to continue, David? We can wait until Mark.
Mark's not much. Let's just continue. He'll be right back. Let's just keep going. This is a good story. I want to.
Well,
Go ahead.
Dr. Odum taught me the meaning of responsibility. The embodied energy, and when you're going to college and the system is embodying this much energy in you, you need to give something back. You need to give back a proportion because that's the way the system works. It has to have. If it doesn't, it's not going to waste energy on something that's not providing feedbacks. And so that was my whole career was related to that, was giving those feedbacks. In fact, when I applied for that Dr. Odum's job after he retired in '96, I think is when he retired, I was interviewed by all the people in the department, and I was very underimpressed with the dead wood in the department and the things that weren't happening. And there were some great people, but the department as a whole was scary to me, and I didn't want that job. And so I justified losing it to you, Martha, because it really wasn't me. I was accomplishing so much in consulting where I was doing applied work. Yeah. And I did a lot of research in consulting, but it was all applied. And I really think that's an important part of research. I think a lot of academic research is not really feeding back to the system very well. So I learned that. Well, that was one of the things I learned from him, was the meaning of responsibility.
Feeding back. You got
the other thing I learned from him, I can say, is the importance of data. And he was very sketchy on his data collection, as you well know. He didn't worry about doing statistics wasn't necessary. If you couldn't see it in a few samples, it probably wasn't worth studying. As the feeling I got, and I'm still that way. I abhor these crazy statistics that people do, but I do believe in my data, and I do believe in data, and that was one of the things he taught, was that no matter the consequences, you need to trust the data. If you're collecting them and they're collected well, you need to trust them, even if they violate your most strongly held opinions. And that's something archaeology is my hobby, and it's my passion now, is archaeology. And so the data say that people were here much earlier than the Clovis period. And I recently did a dig that we got the minimum of 26,000 years for people living along next to a spring on the Santa Fe River. We found evidence that there were at least there 26,000 years ago, not earlier. So during the height of the glacial maximum.
Wow.
But I believe in data and not dogma. And that's something for a young scientist like you, David. I don't know if you've learned that on your own yet, but he helped
I
me.
I recall Dr. Odom saying when I was at Florida, he's like, "Well, are you going to believe your model or are you going to believe your data?"
Yeah.
So
Which
sometimes your
did,
data told your models wrong, and I think it's
which,
usually
which did you believe?
yeah.
Yeah, no, he just and I've listening to the podcast you've already done. It's just really great hearing his methods with models and how models weren't the end. The models were just a learning experience.
Yeah.
And the models didn't fit the data. The model was wrong, and that's so important. That there's just so much of that, and so many places where that's important in life. And it's not just it's obviously in your social life as well as your academic life.
I think one thing thinking about models is, I think I was looking at your, your publication record and just the amount of publications you had just on the treatment wetlands while you were doing all this, applied work as well is phenomenal. And, I think we can owe a lot of your work to the success of ecological engineering, because I think, the basis of ecological engineering has really been the treatment wetland. I mean, that's really the kernel that's really gotten it started. And I think still carries a lot of it even today. And I was kind of curious if you could just kind of think back and walk us through, what were some of the tough situations you found yourself in convincing people that, treatment wetlands were a solution. And because it's not always obvious to people, right? I mean, a lot of people are like, what are you talking about? That sounds horrible. You're putting what into nature and so forth.
Well, you guys started it, and that led actually to the Warren S. Henderson Wetlands Protection Act, part of it. And Mark knows about this. It was put in really because of the Cypress Dome project and Claremont project and the other projects that had been done by the University of Florida, to allow this experimental use of natural wetlands for wastewater discharge. But it had to be proven on a case-by-case basis. I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars for clients to prove that we could at least try this, and it was a nightmare. I mean, it made a lot of money for consultants, but it really didn't improve things. And what it really boiled down to ultimately was we don't really want wastewater and wetlands. Stormwater is okay, and so we had a stormwater to wetland rule, and I taught the classes down at Marco Island, the permitting classes on that for 15 or 16 years, maybe 17 years. I went every year to Marco Island, enjoyed myself, and taught about stormwater discharge to wetland. So there was this, and the agencies haven't changed. They cannot open their minds. They're constantly being replaced by younger people that don't have experience. Their leaders are just the mouthpiece for the governor, whoever that is, or the secretary, and the secretary is a mouthpiece for the governor right now because we're under Republican control, 100% control in our Florida government. And they are inflexible. They don't want to rock the boat at all. And so it's much easier to say no than to say yes, or to say, let's try that. And they don't do that anymore. So, and I had experience with that the whole time. I was beating my head against those challenges the whole time I was developing treatment wetlands. I guess my worst experience was I organized a symposium down in Orlando and invited everybody to go the next step on accepting treatment wetlands. And about 5 people showed up. Those were the speakers, and no audience showed up. And that was the most embarrassing time of my life. So I had all the heads of the water management districts and the DEP there, and no, a dozen audience. It was a giant auditorium. So there was a lot of challenges, but
We think I think Dr. Odom obviously didn't shy away from rocking the boat. Intellectually, he loved his outlandish ideas. And I remember one time he telling me, he's like, "Well, it usually takes about 20 years for my ideas to sink in with people." And of course, I was just fascinated, being a 20-something-year-old, that he had the time horizon to see his ideas in that kind of time frame. But I was just wondering if he ever kind of presented any kind of inspiration for that kind of just attitude, like you really got to move forward with your
well, it was
convictions.
a responsibility thing. I was in a position when I went into consulting, I had no idea I was going to be doing treatment wetlands. that I knew about treatment wetlands, being at the University of Florida. But I was put into a position where I had the opportunity to really help the technology bloom. And I was, like I said, I worked on 200 different projects over 17 years that many of which were led to full-scale studies, or pilot studies and then full-scale. And I was studying other ones that other people were designing. And we did the North American Treatment Wetland Database at that time, where we went to every treatment wetland in North America that had data and put them all in a database. And so I got to look at everybody's data in the whole country. And the technology was being tried out in all sorts of places. It was failing in a lot of places. And so I got to be go document failures in Arkansas and places like that, where they were just dumping ammonia-rich wastewater into these wetlands. They couldn't keep anything alive in those systems. Or they were doing subsurface flow wetlands that didn't work at all because they would plug up and just become surface flow wetlands. So, but then I had so much help from Bob Cadillac and during the last half of that time period in terms of working on these things. I hired him as a sub-consultant many times, and we worked together just as for different agencies on other projects. So it's just wonderful having a mentor. And he went back all the way to the Odum days when they had the first conferences on treatment wetlands. Bob Cadillac was there.
Right. Yeah, it's just fascinating. Well, you brought along some slides for us. I don't know if this is a good time maybe there's a few of those you wanted to
Yeah, I'd
share
like
with
to.
us?
I've got some pictures of past things, and nobody's really touched on the Odum's early years. And I just want people to know that at the Springs Welcome Center, we have an Odum scholar area where there's various things from Dr. Odum available that I've been collecting. And so these slides show that and some of the background on Dr. Odum that I've been learning about by reading about his early history and stuff. So if we could do that, you want to give me a share?
I think you have
We
it.
still have it.
Just might mention that the Springs Institute's offices are in High Springs, Florida. And for all of you out there in DVD land that may want to stop by and see what Bob's talking about, they're in.
Yeah, thank you. And I've got a picture of the office. You'll see it. So.
Okay.
Share screen. So it's ready. Oops.
This will be great. These pictures I took a peek at them earlier. Some gems in there. Is it working?
I don't know. I'm just seeing you guys. I'm not seeing my.
Go down to the bottom and share screen.
Here it is. Yeah, I think I've found the right one now. All right. Okay. Can you see it yet?
No.
There it is.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to go up a slide.
The arrow keys should work on the keyboard, I think. Maybe. It depends on if you're.
No.
Yeah.
Page it up. This is why I was thinking about you doing it.
Oh, I think I have it. Let's see. Do I have it? For me to do it, I can navigate.
Yeah, it's not letting me change it this time. It's just beeping at me.
There. How about that? And I'll put this in.
Do you have it up now?
You see it?
Well, I'm on
Yeah.
share right now.
Up at the top, you could stop sharing, Bob, and let Dave do it. Okay.
Okay. Oh, good. Thank you, Dave. I knew you could do it. Okay. So Dr. Odum was born in 1924. So that's 100 years ago. And he was raised in Chapel Hill but went out to the U.S. Air Force or the Army Air Corps. I'm getting different opinions in different places, but his resume says the Air Force. But that's where he really started getting into the system level stuff, was in meteorology. And he was assigned to the Tropical Meteorology Station in Panama. Obviously did his work at Yale and had all these other things that we're really not talking about. But I hope I hope you continue to get podcasts from these different things. Can you go to the next slide? I just love that picture
Yeah.
of Dr. Odom, the face of confidence there.
Are you seeing the screen?
We're still seeing the
Dr.
first
Odom.
slide.
Yeah, just
Oh. Oh, my side, I'm seeing it's flipping around. Let's see. Hold on. Now what do you see? Okay. We'll just do it. We'll do it this way then.
So we went to high school in Chapel Hill, and I found this. I found his yearbook. I picked up a lot of documents when the Center for Wetlands had the downside, and found his yearbook. And there's Dr. Odom as a junior in high school. Next slide. He was in the band. I don't know if you knew this, Mark, but he played the flute. He played the flute.
I played the flute. I'll be darned.
Thomas Odom, and he's back there in the same shirt he was in the other picture with his flute. And he's got some girl circled here, so I'm sort of wondering about that. Her name was Anne something or other, but I'm just wondering if there was something going on back there in high school. None of us know about. Mary probably doesn't even know about that. Next slide. So there he is in the Air Force or the Army Air Corps, whichever it was. And he's quite a guy. Next slide.
So that had to be during the war, right? Right?
Yeah, it was 46.
Yeah.
It was around 46. It was after getting at the end of the war. He was studying hurricanes. I mean, he flew into hurricanes, he told me. He was really into birding. And this was in 1946. I got his collection of the Chat, the North Carolina BirdLife magazines from the time that he was very active. And I've got circled here the Chapel Hill Bird Club. Howard T. Odom was the census supervisor for the Chapel Hill Bird Club, and he was really into birding. And that came, next slide, came from his brother Eugene. Well, he was publishing in BirdLife, and this is one of his publications, how to do a lake count at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He says in here that University Lake, where I got to study after Suzanne Bailey left it, had the highest diversity of birds in North Carolina. But he was showing how to do a survey around University Lake. So he was collecting data and publishing at this time. Next slide. And he was doing the Christmas bird count every year. And the first one is a publication, The Production of Edge Effect in North Carolina Woodlands by Thunderstorm Winds. And we've just had some storms recently that brought a lot of trees down. That makes openings, in the ecosystem. And he was looking at that, how that was enhancing bird life. And this bottom one is just the tail end of the Christmas bird count from 1946. And you'll notice the last two lines, Eugene P. Odom and H. Thomas Odom, they were birding together. And his brother, of course, is 10 years older and was just a major influence on Dr. Odom at this time. As I take my sons birding with me, or I did when they were this age. So he was doing a lot of Christmas bird counts, and there's about 4 years of him really active with the bird club. Next slide. This is a picture I got of him at Silver Springs when he was out there the day Scott Nixon was there. And of course, the studies I've talked about led to these papers in both ecological monographs and limnology and oceanography. Next slide. Betty McMahon, I said, was his good friend and my good friend. She was my advisor when I was at Chapel Hill, and my good friend for the rest of her life. She was an artist, and she illustrated things. And this is the art she did for Silver Springs. That's what a healthy Silver Springs looked like in 1952, based on Dr. Odom's paper. Next slide. Okay, this came up in one of your earlier lectures. I think Walt brought it up. Pat Kangas brought this to me. So Pat Odom gave it to Pat. Now this is the analog computer for Silver River. It's set up for Silver River. You can see P over on the left side. That's photosynthesis. R, the respiration. H, the herbivores. The C, the carnivores. The TC, the top carnivores. And E, the export. And of course, there was bread in here somewhere that was going into the river. So the Silver Springs study is here. It still works. Got 6-volt batteries. You have to hook up to it to run it. Nice. So there is an analog computer still available, and it's at the Forest Springs Welcome Center.
This came up in a conversation, an email conversation with Charlie Hall just the other day about was there an analog computation of maximum power? So might want to let Charlie know that this is still around.
Well, I hope you'll watch this interview next week.
Yeah, we'll let him know.
And so this is what Mark Brown turned that into. And we call these spaghetti diagrams affectionately when I was studying under Dr. Odum. But Mark is the most artistic, I think, of Dr. Odum's students, and he drew the most beautiful diagrams. And when I did the write up on Silver Springs restudy and everything, I used Mark's diagrams. They're just excellent and complicated. And we never tried to simulate this, Mark, but
No, a much reduced one, what I call a macroscopic mini model we've done, but not that one.
Not this one. Yeah.
Maybe it's time to try it.
Yeah, nowadays you can probably do it. You get AI to do it for you.
Oh yeah.
Next slide. So then Dr. Odum did treatment wetlands, and this is a picture of him out at, I think, at the Cypress Domes. But he really started the treatment wetlands work with the estuarine ponds, that's been mentioned before, and some of the other blog posts. And then, like I said, we started the Spartina. We started looking at Spartina marsh, how it was adapted. And it was not maladapted. It was a very lush marsh. And that leads to my subsidy stress theories and stuff like that. And then the Center for Wetlands came out of that. And he just was always looking for money. And when he had money, he would use that money as effectively as possible, which is something that I've always tried to do too in consulting and with the nonprofit Springs Institute. Next slide. And this was his concept. And now where we're at right now in Florida is we're designing treatment wetlands on a fairly routine basis now for recharging the aquifer. This ties both things together because the aquifer is depleted because we're pumping. We use all our water in North Florida comes from the Florida aquifer, which means that a third of the flow of the springs is gone. A third of the flow, 40% of the flow at Silver River is gone because of depletion of the aquifer, overuse of the aquifer. And Dr. Odum said, well, let's recycle our wastewater to the aquifer into our surface water. And as our aquifer declines and our spring flows decline, it's killing our surface waters. The Santa Fe River now is almost never clear, and it used to be clear more than 50% of the time. It was like a spring run. It's lost over 200 million gallons a day of spring flow. The Santa Fe River and the Silver Springs itself has lost over 200 million gallons a day of flow. Next slide. So thank you, Dr. Odum. We just recently turned, well, it's not recent now, about almost 10 years ago, we turned the spray field at Lake City, Florida, into a treatment wetland. And Wetland Solutions did the conceptual on that, and then the state said we need to do a springs project, so we're going to turn the spray field into a wetland, and they did, and now it's extremely successful, beautiful treatment wetland, similar to the Sweetwater wetland, except it's not open to the public except for auto field trips. And here's the book that I did with Bob Cadlick. It's been republished. There was a second edition with Scott Wallace that really added to it. It added subsurface flow wetlands that Scott is specialized in, and now Cadlick has a third edition that's really just about marsh wetlands, about constructive wetlands. Next slide. So this was a great thing that we did in 1994. We had a 70th birthday party for Dr. Odum. And there's a lot of people in this picture that you've talked to. And I'm going to blow up, the next slide blows up some of those. And we can come back to this one if you want. So you can point. You see Dr. Odum there, David?
I see Dr.
There's EP Odum.
There's EP Odum in the front. Where's?
Okay, we'll go up to Science Man.
Right there.
Yeah, so
there you are. There's you, right?
There's me, and right next to me is Mark.
There's Mark. Oh, there's Charlie.
Charlie Hall. Dr. Odum, upper right. Oh, Bill Mitch.
Oh, there he is, right there. Okay, yeah. Yep,
Dr.
in his blue suit.
And that's Betty McMahon next to him. They were so close.
Oh, here.
Yeah. He always lived in Chapel Hill. Bill Mitch is on the far side, next to Jack Ewell.
I don't know what to say. Jack, I don't recognize.
Bill Mitch is on the far left side of the picture. Go to the far left.
Oh, there he is there, looking away.
Next to him.
That's Jack.
You got Charlie. I don't know everybody here. Scott Nixon, I think, is down here below Charlie. Mark, is that
one of these?
Yeah, that
This
one,
guy?
the one
This
with
one?
the striped shirt next to it. Mark, do you know if that's Scott?
I think
I
so, yes. Mhm.
I only met him once. Okay,
And then
Bob
below him is
Costanza.
Bob Costanza
Costanza and his
There's
girlfriend
Costanza here.
and Joy Bartholomew. the
Joy,
make- Yeah,
his girlfriend.
This
And
is
then over,
Joy.
yeah.
Joy. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know who the person next to EP is. Mark, do you know that gentleman?
I can't remember his name. Uh,
Okay, there's some other ones here. John Day is up there. Over one more.
There's
That's
John right there.
John
Right.
Day.
That him?
Ed Kunstler is below him. He was on my committee, and
This guy?
he taught the first course on the ecology of wetlands, I think, in the United States. Ed Kunstler did at Chapel Hill, and I took that. Um, um,
This is Dan Campbell, looks like to me.
that's Dan Campbell. That's Clay Montague in front of Dan.
Clay's here.
Ellen
Uh-huh.
Kennedy below him.
Okay. And there's Betty.
That's the Clay,
Betty
that's
Odom.
Betty Odom. Kathy Ewell's up there right below Dr. Odom.
And then
So
right in
this-
front of her is Tom Fontaine.
This one or no, this one.
That one,
oh,
yeah.
that's Tom. Yeah, that's Tom. I knew Tom at South Florida District too. Okay, so this was a neat gathering. Next slide. And Charlie Hall really did a job here pulling this book together. So Maximum Power is all about Odom and his students, really. There were 36 contributing authors in that book. So that's a really priceless book if you don't have it. It's a good book. Next slide. This is a picture that was taken of me and Dr. Odom at his retirement party in 1996. And I recently did a deep dive presentation to the Florida Springs Institute, and there's a link down here to that presentation. So anybody that's watching this, you don't need to open it right now, but anybody that's watching this that wants to have a much more detailed set of slides about Dr. Odom and what I learned from him, you can take it. And I was younger back in '96 already. Dr. Odom was looking old even at that point. Next slide.
I don't see much change really. The beard, you got the facial hair going on now.
So I started the Springs Institute in 2010. We moved to an office in High Springs and put this mural up in High Springs around 2015 or so. We got kicked out of that office eventually, and so we've gone. Next slide. Oh, not that slide. I started writing books about springs at that time, and so my first book was Silenced Springs. That's a very detailed book about the status of springs at that time. Next slide. And that's where we are now, the Florida Springs Welcome Center, which is on Main Street in High Springs. And we have a much bigger space. We have a museum. You can see in the window, there's a manatee skeleton. We have displays, many displays about springs and archaeology of springs and the paleontology of springs. We have a little shop where you can buy shark's teeth and paintings and things and t-shirts. And then we have Dr. Odom's Corner, which is a place I hope visiting scholars will come to in the future, where we got almost all of Dr. Odom's books. And next slide. And we have a lot more than that. We have the things that the Center for Wetlands took out of the library. We have a complete set of Dr. Odom's ecological monographs, including the first one, volume 27, where his Silver Springs paper is. I have his copy of the Silver Springs paper there. And you see these all have Dr. Odom on the bottom. He would bind these every year. He was very almost anal in terms of binding reports, including all our dissertations. Next slide. And so I have a bunch of the dissertations. Maurice Sell on the right here, Carolyn Burgess, I didn't know, Zucchetto's dissertation, Walt Boynton's dissertation, Wade Smith. And anybody that comes along and can claim these as the author can take it. But so and I've been giving several back. I mean, Pat Kangas and others. And mine's there. And I think Mark, I don't know, I'm sure you have your original. This red one is the cadmium study that I did with Odom, where we looked at cadmium as a controller in ecosystems. And I forgot to mention, my final experiment at Silver Springs was I put cadmium in my mesocosms. I put strips of pure cadmium in my mesocosms at different dosages. Don't tell anybody. And it erodes very, very slowly. It's very insoluble, but it is soluble very slightly. And I was able to weigh those strips at the end of a 2-week period of colonization and measure and estimate the concentration of cadmium in those mesocosms from that, based on the flow and the amount of weight loss from the cadmium strip. And it also stimulated productivity. There was an optimum cadmium concentration for productivity, which when I went through the literature on cadmium, I found it in all sorts of data sets where they totally ignored the low concentrations and the stimulatory effect of cadmium. It was everywhere. And it's true. Conway report in here. Anyway, we've got a lot of these things, plus a lot of the published things. Next slide. Just as a tribute to Odum, this is, I think, the common denominator, the uniformity of systems in nature. Energy is the common denominator. And that's what he taught me more than anything, is we're made out of energy. I mean, it's become my faith in the world, and everything is based on understanding of the energy. Next slide. And we had a thank you birthday party, and I think Mark's going to have another one at the conference in January for Odum's 100th birthday. Mark's talked about that. That's all the slide. Wait a minute. Is it?
That's the last one.
That's the last one.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
That's great. Oh,
Thanks
man. That's awesome. Walk down memory lane. That's good. Oh, man. I think I'm going to be there in December. I'm going to definitely make it down to High Springs now. Put it on my to-do.
I hope you do.
Yeah. It'd be
We'll
around
put you in your visiting scholar chair.
That'd be great.
Glad to have you.
Well, Bob, this has been wonderful. I can't thank you enough for joining us and sharing some of the history of HT and you and your incredible legacy as well. I mean, the stuff that you've done is just amazing. The quantity and quality. It's just great.
Well, thank you very much. It really helps be in the right place and know the right people at the right time. I attribute everything to my mentors, and Dr. Odum and he opened my eyes more than anybody.
Yeah, this has been great. I really appreciate you doing this. I know that I've gotten quite a bit of feedback from some of the people who've participated, and they love watching them, and some other folks too. So I know they'll love this one also.
I watched all 10 of them. That's an hour and a half each. I really thank you guys for putting the time in to do this. This is not a small chunk of time for you to sit through these and do this. I'm doing interviews now with some of the key people in the Springs. I've interviewed Jim Stevenson, who started the Springs Initiative in Florida, Springs Task Force, and Guy Marwick, who started the Silver River Museum and has been a friend of Springs forever. And those are on our website too. So I'll be doing more interviews like that. And I know it takes a lot of work to do it. So thanks to the two of you for doing this.
If you want to, you could put a link to these interviews on your website. So
I've already asked my new director to do that. So we'll definitely do that. Yeah, just one other thing about the Springs Institute. It's the Howard T. Odum Florida Springs Institute, and Betty Odum was on my board during her lifetime, and then Mary was on the board until just a couple of years ago. She finally stepped down. She's living in Tampa now. So his second wife and his daughter were parts of the institute, and they totally approved of what we were doing. So having his name on there it's an honor, I think, and hopefully between him and the Center for Wetlands, we'll keep that name alive for a long time. And I just hope his work and his accomplishments are understood by the people in the future as much as we've benefited from them. So
yeah.
Thank you, guys.
So an interesting thing, speaking of that, I forget who it was now, just the other day said that they thought it would be really cool at the Sweetwater wetland if there was a kiosk that said a little bit about HT and his contributions to the science, not just to wetlands science, but to science in general. I forget, it was somebody who's not from here, but who really understood that his contributions to to science in general, and we're much bigger than being named the HT Odum Center for Wetlands. And so it's something to think about. Maybe there should be a kiosk there.
That's a good thought. Debbie, my wife, Debbie Siegel, who's the president of HT Odum.Dr, has the ear of the committee that's in charge of Sweetwater wetlands. And they don't always do what she suggests, but that's certainly something. Yeah. We'll do that.
All right.
Sweetwater is a testament. It's a living testament to Dr. Odum's legacy. It is his legacy.
And we should mention for people that don't know where that is, in Gainesville, Florida, south of town, there is a very large prairie called the Paynes Prairie. And on the north side of that, there's this magnificent treatment wetland that Bob and his group designed. And if you look at it from the air, as I understand it, it's the head of an alligator, right?
It sure is. Yeah, just look at an aerial photo now, you can see it clearly. Yeah, it's the gator head. That's the engineer that laid it out was a gator fan, obviously.
Yeah.
We all agreed it was wonderful. We told him no straight lines, and so that's what he came up with.
Yeah, and it is. They have a parking lot out front for about 50 cars, and it's full constantly. People are out there birding and walking, and I mean it's a magnificent system. It's a wonderful addition to Gainesville. So anybody coming from out of country, out of state, it comes to Gainesville, you need to go see the Sweetwater Branch treatment wetland. It's great.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good.
All right,
Okay,
Bob, thank you. I can't thank you enough. This has been great.
I've enjoyed it. Take care.
I'll see
Thanks,
you
Bob.
at the next meeting that we share, whenever
I
that
hope
is.
so. I hope so.
Okay.
Take care.
All righty.
Guys have a good one.
Where's the record? Oh, there it is up there.